Marcus Whitlow was fired from Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing for refusing to sign off on a $3 pressure sensor. His supervisor called it insubordination. His co-workers called it career suicide. Marcus, a single father raising 2 kids on a warehouse floor wage, called it the only decision he could live with. 3 days after he was walked out of the building he had worked in for 11 years, that same $3 sensor failure grounded a $980 million defense contract, and the company that fired him found itself begging a fired warehouse worker to come back and explain, under oath, exactly what he had tried to tell them the week before. If you love stories about the quiet, stubborn people who do the right thing, even when it costs them everything, press subscribe now, because this one is going to stay with you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Whitlow had worked the quality control line at Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing's Wichita facility for 11 years, long enough to know the sound of every machine on the floor, long enough that younger inspectors still came to him with questions their supervisors couldn't answer. He was 44 years old, a single father to 2 children, Ellie, 13, and Danny, 9, since his wife Renee had left 3 years earlier in a divorce that had cost him nearly everything but the kids, whom he had fought for and won primary custody of in a process that had taught him more about patience than 11 years on a factory floor ever had. Corrigan Aerospace was not a household name, but within the narrow, specialized world of defense subcontracting, it mattered enormously. The company manufactured precision components for hydraulic and pneumatic systems used in a range of military and aerospace applications, and its single largest client, by a wide margin, was a prime defense contractor building next-generation targeting pod systems for the United States Air Force under a contract worth just under $1 billion. Corrigan's components were small, unglamorous, and absolutely critical, the kind of parts nobody thinks about until they fail at exactly the wrong moment 30,000 feet in the air. The trouble began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in April, when Marcus was running final inspection on a batch of pressure sensors destined for the targeting pod's hydraulic control assembly. These sensors were small, unremarkable-looking things, barely the size of a thumb, each one costing the company roughly $3 to manufacture, a rounding error in a contract worth nearly $1 billion. Their job was simple and non-negotiable: to accurately detect and report hydraulic pressure within a tolerance so tight that a deviation of even a few percentage points could cause a targeting system to misalign under stress. Marcus flagged 11 sensors out of a batch of 400 for inconsistent readings during calibration testing, readings that fell technically within the outer edge of the acceptable tolerance range, but that, in Marcus's 11 years of experience, showed a pattern he had learned to distrust: a slow drift in accuracy under repeated thermal cycling that the standard one-time calibration test was not designed to catch. He had seen a nearly identical pattern once before, 6 years earlier, in a batch of sensors from a different supplier, sensors that had passed initial inspection and later failed catastrophically in the field, an incident that had cost Corrigan a smaller contract and had taught Marcus, more than any training manual ever could, to trust the small, nagging feeling in his gut when something looked technically fine but felt wrong. He brought his concerns to his direct supervisor, a production manager named Craig Delamore, who had been with the company for 4 years and who was, by every account, under enormous pressure that quarter to meet an aggressive shipment deadline tied to the defense contract's payment milestones. Craig looked at Marcus's data, acknowledged that the readings were within the documented tolerance range, and told him, in words Marcus would remember precisely for the rest of his life, that the company did not have the luxury of holding up a 9-figure shipment over sensors that technically passed spec, based on nothing more than a hunch from the warehouse floor. Marcus asked for 48 hours to run an extended thermal cycling test on the flag sensors, a test that would definitively confirm or rule out the drift pattern he suspected. Craig denied the request, citing the shipment deadline, and instructed Marcus to sign off on the full batch as is. Marcus refused. The confrontation that followed was, by workplace standards, almost anticlimactic. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene on the factory floor. Craig Delamore simply told Marcus that his refusal to sign the inspection certification left the company no choice but to escalate the matter to plant management. And 2 days later, Marcus was called into a small conference room where the plant's general manager, a man named Victor Kowalski, whom Marcus had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in 11 years, informed him that his employment with Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing was terminated, effective immediately, for insubordination and failure to perform assigned quality control duties in accordance with company procedure. Marcus asked, plainly, whether anyone intended to run the extended thermal test on the flag sensors before shipment. Victor Kowalski told him that the batch had already shipped the previous afternoon, having been signed off by a second-shift inspector after Marcus's refusal, and that the matter, as far as the company was concerned, was closed. Marcus drove home that afternoon with a small cardboard box of 11 years' worth of personal effects on the passenger seat beside him, and he sat in his driveway for nearly 20 minutes before he found the will to go inside and tell his children that their father no longer had a job. Ellie, 13 and sharp enough to read the weight in her father's face before he said a word, asked him only one question. Had he done something wrong? Marcus told her no, and he told her the truth, plainly, the way he had promised himself he always would with his kids after the divorce had taught him how much damage half-truths could do to a family. He told her he had refused to sign a piece of paper he did not believe was true, and that sometimes doing the right thing costs you something, and that he did not regret it, and would not, no matter what came next. He did not know, sitting in that driveway, how quickly he would be tested on that promise. 3 days after Marcus was terminated, during a scheduled system integration test at the prime contractor's testing facility in Fort Worth, Texas, one of the targeting pod's hydraulic control assemblies exhibited an anomalous pressure reading during a simulated high-stress maneuver, a reading that, had it occurred during an actual flight operation rather than a controlled ground test, could have caused the targeting system to lose calibration at a critical moment. The test engineers traced the anomaly, after nearly 18 hours of diagnostic work, to a pressure sensor manufactured by Corrigan Aerospace, a sensor from the exact batch Marcus had flagged and been overruled on 3 days earlier. The prime contractor immediately suspended acceptance of the entire shipment pending a full investigation, a decision that triggered a formal stop-work review under the terms of the defense contract, a review that placed the entire $980 million agreement in jeopardy pending Corrigan's ability to demonstrate, conclusively, that the quality control failure was isolated and would not recur. Corrigan stock, held privately by a small group of investors, was not publicly traded, but the internal panic that swept through the company's leadership in the days that followed was, by every account of employees who lived through it, indistinguishable for what a publicly traded company might experience in the face of a catastrophic earnings collapse. Victor Kowalski, the plant general manager who had signed Marcus's termination paperwork 4 days earlier, found himself, on a Friday afternoon, sitting across a conference table from the prime contractor's chief quality officer, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Dr. Renata Alvarez, who asked him a question that would haunt him for the rest of his tenure at the company. She asked him whether anyone at Corrigan had raised concerns about this specific batch of sensors before shipment, and whether those concerns had been documented. Victor Kowalski, to his credit, did not lie. He told her the truth, that a quality control inspector had flagged 11 sensors from the batch for inconsistent thermal cycling behavior, had requested additional testing, had been denied that testing due to shipment deadline pressure, and had subsequently been terminated for refusing to certify the batch without it. Dr. Alvarez's response, delivered without raising her voice, was simple and devastating. She told Victor Kowalski that Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing had fired the one employee who had correctly identified the exact defect, now threatening to end their contract, and that she needed to understand, in detail, exactly what that employee had found and exactly why his concerns had been overridden, before she could recommend to her own leadership whether Corrigan remained a viable long-term supplier at all. Marcus received the call on a Saturday morning, 4 days after his termination, while he was in the kitchen making pancakes for Ellie and Danny, a small, deliberate ritual he had started after Renee left, a way of proving to his kids and to himself that Saturdays could still feel like Saturdays, even when everything else had changed. The number on his phone was unfamiliar, a Wichita area code he didn't recognize, and he almost let it go to voicemail before some old habit of always answering an unfamiliar number in case it was one of the kids' schools, made him pick up. It was Victor Kowalski. His voice, Marcus noted immediately, sounded nothing like the composed, faintly dismissive voice that had fired him 4 days earlier. Victor asked Marcus whether he would be willing to come in that same afternoon if possible to discuss the sensor batch he had flagged before his termination. Marcus asked, carefully, whether this meant the company was offering him his job back. Victor told him it was more complicated than that the prime contractor had suspended the entire shipment following a failure that matched exactly the concerns Marcus had raised, and that Corrigan needed his documentation, his testing notes, and his direct account of what had happened, both for the prime contractor's investigation, and Victor admitted with what Marcus would later describe as the first honest thing he'd heard the man say, to figure out how badly the company had damaged itself by not listening to him in the first place. Marcus stood in his kitchen for a long moment, spatula still in hand, Ellie and Danny watching him from the table with the particular alertness kids develop when they sense an adult conversation is more important than it sounds. He told Victor Kowalski he would think about it and call him back within the hour. He did not call Craig Delamore's supervisor to gloat, though he would have been forgiven for wanting to. He called, instead, an old friend from his time in the Army Reserve, a man named Terrence Okafor who had gone on to become a contracts attorney specializing in federal defense procurement disputes, a field so specific that Marcus had always privately thought of Terrence's career as a kind of running joke between them, a career too strange and too narrow to ever actually matter. It mattered now. Terrence listened to the entire situation over the phone without interrupting, and when Marcus finished, he told him something that changed the entire shape of what happened next. He told Marcus that under federal defense contracting whistleblower protections, specifically the provisions built into the Defense Contract Whistleblower Protection Act, an employee who is terminated for raising legitimate safety or quality concerns related to a federal defense contract has significant legal standing that could not only result in reinstatement and back pay, but could also position Marcus, if he chose to pursue it, as a formally protected witness in whatever investigation the prime contractor and potentially the Department of Defense's own Inspector General office were about to conduct. Terrence told Marcus, plainly, that he should absolutely go talk to Corrigan that afternoon, but that he should not go alone and that he should not sign anything, and that Terrence himself would be there within the hour. The meeting that afternoon took place not in the same small conference room where Marcus had been fired 4 days earlier, but in Corrigan Aerospace's largest boardroom, a room Marcus had walked past 1,000 times over 11 years without ever once being invited inside. Victor Kowalski was there, along with 2 attorneys from Corrigan's outside counsel, a nervous-looking Craig Delamore, and participating by video call from Fort Worth, Dr. Renata Alvarez of the Prime Contractor's Quality Office. Terrence Okafor sat beside Marcus, calm and unhurried in the way Marcus had always envied in people whose job required them to be calm in rooms exactly like this one. Marcus, dressed in the same clean flannel shirt he wore to church on Sundays, laid out his documentation with the same methodical precision he had brought to 11 years of inspection reports. The original calibration readings, the specific thermal cycling pattern he had identified, the 6-year-old incident report from the earlier supplier failure that had first taught him to recognize this exact signature of defect, and the written request for extended testing that Craig Delamore had denied, a request Marcus, in a habit born of 11 years of institutional caution, had submitted through the company's internal quality management software rather than verbally, leaving a permanent, time-stamped digital record of exactly what he had asked for and exactly when he had asked for it. Dr. Alvarez, watching from the screen at the end of the table, asked Marcus a series of highly technical questions about the specific drift pattern he had observed, questions that made 2 of Corrigan's own engineers, sitting quietly along the back wall of the boardroom, visibly straightened in their chairs. Marcus answered every question directly, without embellishment, in the same plain, unhurried voice he had used to explain sensor calibration to a dozen younger inspectors over the years. He did not raise his voice. He did not mention that he had been fired for exactly the concern now being treated, for days later, as the single most important piece of information in the room. Craig Dellimore, for his part, sat largely silent through the meeting, occasionally offering brief, clipped answers when directly addressed, visibly aware that every person in that room, including his own company's outside counsel, understood exactly whose decision had turned a contained quality concern into a $980 million crisis. Dr. Alvarez, near the end of the meeting, asked Marcus directly whether he would be willing to formally document his findings as part of the prime contractor's official investigation, and whether he would be willing to serve as a technical witness if the investigation escalated to a formal Department of Defense inquiry. Marcus, after a brief glance at Terrence, said yes. Over the following 6 weeks, a joint investigation between the prime contractor's quality office and Corrigan Aerospace's own engineering team confirmed, through extensive extended thermal cycling testing, exactly the failure pattern Marcus had identified from the beginning. All 11 flagged sensors, along with an additional 19 sensors from the same production batch that had not been individually flagged but shared the same manufacturing lot number, exhibited measurable accuracy drift under repeated thermal stress, a drift that fell within acceptable range during the brief, single-cycle calibration test Corrigan's standard procedure required, but that would very likely have exceeded safe operating tolerance under the sustained thermal cycling targeting pod actually experiences during extended flight operations. The investigation further determined that the root cause traced back not to any individual inspector's error, but to a manufacturing process change implemented 8 months earlier, a change to the sensor's internal calibration adhesive that had been approved by Corrigan's engineering department without a full battery of extended environmental testing, in the interest of a modest per-unit cost savings. It was, in the language of the final report, an entirely preventable defect that Corrigan's own standard testing protocol had been inadequately designed to catch, and that had very nearly made it into operational use on a live defense platform. The Department of Defense's Office of Inspector General, notified as a matter of standard procedure given the scale of the contract involved, opened a formal review of Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing's quality control processes, a review that concluded 7 months later with a mandated overhaul of Corrigan's testing protocols, a substantial monetary penalty, and, most consequentially, for Marcus personally, formal written findings that credited a since-terminated quality control inspector with identifying and attempting to prevent the defect 3 days before it manifested in testing. Findings that noted the inspector had been terminated, in the Inspector General's own carefully chosen words, for conduct that, upon full review, constituted the correct and responsible exercise of his quality assurance duties. Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing, facing both the Inspector General's findings and Terrence Okafor's formal whistleblower retaliation complaint filed on Marcus's behalf, offered Marcus reinstatement with full back pay within a month of the investigation's preliminary findings. Marcus accepted the reinstatement, though not, he was careful to clarify to Terrence and later to Ellie and Danny, out of any particular loyalty to the company that had fired him, but because the position itself, quality control on systems that genuinely mattered, was work he believed in, and because he had, in his own words, earned the right to do that work on his own terms. Those terms, negotiated by Terrence as part of the settlement, were significant. Marcus returned not as a line inspector, but as Corrigan's newly created Director of Quality Assurance Integrity, a position with direct reporting authority to the company's board of directors rather than to plant management, and with explicit contractual authority to halt any shipment, regardless of production deadline pressure, pending resolution of any quality concern he personally determined warranted extended testing. Craig Dellimore resigned from the company 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, a decision Marcus never publicly commented on, though those who worked with him closely understood that Marcus held no particular satisfaction in it, only a quiet, uncomplicated relief that decisions like the one Craig had made would no longer be made by someone with the authority to override a documented safety concern for the sake of shipment deadline. Victor Kowalski remained with the company, and in an unexpected turn that Marcus himself found difficult to fully explain even years later, The two men developed something approaching genuine mutual respect in the years that followed, built on Victor's uncharacteristically honest admission, made privately to Marcus not long after the settlement, that firing him had been the single worst decision of his career, and his equally genuine effort, in the years afterward, to rebuild a quality culture. At the Wichita facility that would never again put a shipment deadline ahead of a documented engineering concern, Marcus told his children the full story slowly, over the following months, in pieces appropriate to their ages, the same careful, honest approach he had brought to telling them about the divorce 3 years earlier. Ellie, 13 at the time of the firing and 14 by the time the investigation concluded, absorbed the story with the particular intensity of a teenager beginning to understand that the adult world did not always reward doing the right thing quickly or fairly or on any predictable timeline at all. She asked her father, more than once during those months, whether he had been scared, sitting in that boardroom 4 days after being fired, laying out evidence to a room full of people who had just taken his job away. Marcus told her the truth, that he had been terrified, that the mortgage did not care whether he had been morally correct, that he had lain awake more than one night during those 4 days running numbers on how long his savings would last if the meeting went nowhere. But he told her, too, that being scared and doing the right thing had never, in his experience, been mutually exclusive, and that the version of himself who would have signed that certification just to keep the paycheck coming was not a version of himself he could have looked her or her brother in the eye and called a good example. Ellie, now a senior in high school and already accepted into an engineering program at Kansas State University, tells people, when a subject comes up, that her father's story is the reason she chose engineering in the first place, not because of the dramatic reversal or the eventual vindication, but because of the 11 flagged censors themselves, the quiet, unglamorous act of a man who noticed something wrong in a piece of equipment the size of his thumb and refused to let it go, even when refusing cost him everything he had. Danny, younger and less inclined toward long reflection, tells people more simply that his dad got fired for being right, and that this is, as far as he is concerned, the single coolest thing that has ever happened to anyone he knows personally. Marcus keeps, in the top drawer of his desk at Corrigan Aerospace, a single one of the 11 flag sensors from that original batch, decommissioned and stripped of any classified specification, but otherwise identical to the ones that nearly made it onto a live defense platform. A small, unremarkable $3 object that came closer than almost anyone outside that boardroom ever fully understood to costing lives and ending careers on a scale far larger than his own. He does not display it prominently. He does not tell the story to every new hire who walks past his desk. But when a young inspector, uncertain and nervous the way Marcus himself once was, comes to him with a flag reading that falls technically within tolerance, but feels wrong in a way the data alone cannot fully explain, Marcus opens that drawer, shows them the sensor, and tells them the story in full, not as a warning about what the company might do to them, but as a reminder of what they owe to the people on the other end of the systems they inspect, people who will never know their names, whose safety depends entirely on a small, unglamorous act of refusing to sign something that isn't true. He built a career, twice now, on the same simple principle that once cost him everything and eventually gave him back more than he lost. That a signature is a promise, and that some promises are worth more than a paycheck, worth more than a job, worth more, in the end, than almost anything except the two kids waiting for him at the kitchen table, watching to see whether their father's words still meant what he had always told them it meant. It did. It still does. And in the quiet, unglamorous work of quality control at a defense manufacturing plant in Wichita, Kansas, that single stubborn fact turned out to matter more than anyone in that boardroom, on the day they fired him, had ever imagined it could. If this story reminded you of someone who once paid a price for doing the right thing, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Share this with someone who needs to know that integrity, even when it costs everything, has a way of maturing in the end, and we will see you in the next story. There's a coda to this story that Marcus rarely tells in full, though it may be the part that matters most to him personally. 18 months after his reinstatement, Corrigan Aerospace was invited, for the first time in its history, to bid on an expanded, multi-year extension of its contract with the prime defense contractor, an extension that would not have been offered to a supplier still under an active inspector general review, and that Dr. Renata Alvarez, in a private conversation with Marcus during a site visit, told him plainly would never have been on the table at all had Corrigan not been able to point credibly to the sweeping quality reforms built directly around the position Marcus now held. She told him something else that day, something Marcus has carried with him since. She told him that in 22 years of quality assurance work across the defense industry, she had reviewed dozens of failure investigations, and that the single clearest predictor of whether a company survived a serious defect scandal with its reputation intact was not the severity of the original failure, but whether that company had, somewhere in its history, an employee like Marcus, someone whose documented concerns, ignored or not, existed on the record before the failure occurred. Companies with a Marcus Whitlow somewhere in their paper trail, she told him, tended to survive. Companies without one tended not to. Marcus thought about that conversation often in the years that followed, particularly on the evenings he spent helping Danny with math homework at the same kitchen table, where he had once told a 13-year-old Ellie that he had just lost his job for refusing to sign a piece of paper. He had never set out to be the kind of employee a defense contractor's quality officer used as a case study in corporate survivability. He had only wanted, on one ordinary Tuesday morning in April, to make sure a $3 sensor did exactly what it was supposed to do, because somewhere at the far end of a supply chain he would never see, a pilot he would never meet was going to trust his life to it. That, in the end, is the whole of what Marcus Whitlow ever wanted anyone to understand about his story. Not that he was fired, and not even that he was proven right. Only that the smallest, most overlooked parts of any system, a sensor, a signature, a single stubborn inspector on a Tuesday morning, are very often the parts that matter most. And that someone, somewhere, has to be willing to say so, even when saying so costs everything they have. To understand why Marcus Whitlow refused to sign that certification, it helps to understand the 11 years that came before it, years that had taught him, slowly and sometimes painfully, exactly what his own name was worth when he put it on a piece of paper. Marcus had joined Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing at 33, after 6 years in the Army Reserve as a mechanic and 2 years working quality control at a smaller automotive parts supplier that had gone under during the 2008 financial crisis. He had married Renee the same year he started at Corrigan, and Ellie had been born 14 months later, followed by Danny 4 years after that. For nearly a decade, the Whitlow family had lived the kind of steady, unremarkable life that Marcus had always privately considered the whole point of working hard in the first place. A modest house on the west side of Wichita, 2 kids in the same elementary school, a wife who taught part-time at a community college, and a paycheck that arrived reliably every other Friday. The divorce, when it came, had nothing to do with Marcus's work, though it reshaped everything about how he approached it afterward. Renee had fallen in love with someone else, a colleague at the community college, and had told Marcus, in a conversation he still remembers with the particular clarity that painful conversations tend to retain, that she needed a life that felt like it was still becoming something, rather than one that had already settled into its final shape. Marcus had not fought the divorce itself, though he had fought, hard and without apology, for primary custody of Ellie and Danny, a fight he won not because Renee was unfit, but because the judge, after months of hearings, concluded that Marcus's steady schedule, his extended family nearby, and his demonstrated day-to-day involvement in the children's lives made him the more stable primary caregiver. That custody battle had cost Marcus nearly all of his savings and had taught him, more thoroughly than any workplace training ever could, the value of a clean, well-documented record. He had learned to keep everything, every school pickup, every doctor's appointment, every conversation with Renee about scheduling, written down and dated, because he had watched, firsthand, how quickly a person's memory of events could be challenged in a room full of people with their own competing interests. That habit, born out of protecting his relationship with his own children, followed him directly onto the factory floor, where it became, without Marcus ever fully realizing the connection until much later, the exact habit that would one day save his career. He had also learned, during those difficult years, something about his own children that shaped how he approached the censor batch 4 days before he was fired. He had learned that Ellie, watching her parents' marriage end, had developed a quiet, careful watchfulness, a habit of noticing when the adults around her were telling the truth and when they were softening it, and that the single most damaging thing Marcus could do to his relationship with her was to let her catch him in even a small dishonesty. He had promised himself, in the aftermath of the divorce, that whatever else happened in his life, his children would never have reason to doubt that their father meant what he said. That promise, more than any corporate quality manual, was the reason he could not bring himself to sign a certification he did not believe to be. The boardroom meeting deserves a fuller account than the summary given earlier, because the specific exchange between Marcus and Dr. Renata Alvarez, more than any other moment in this story, illustrates exactly why the investigation ultimately went the way it did. Dr. Alvarez began by asking Marcus to walk her through, in his own words and without referring to his notes, exactly what he had observed during the original calibration testing. Marcus did so, describing the specific thermal cycling protocol he had run, the way the flag sensors had shown a subtle but consistent drift after the third and fourth cycles, a drift that fell back within tolerance during the single-cycle test the company's standard procedure required, but that suggested, to anyone who had seen the pattern before, an underlying instability that repeated stress would likely worsen. Dr. Alvarez asked him how he had first learned to recognize that specific pattern. Marcus told her about the incident 6 years earlier, a batch of sensors from a different supplier that had passed every standard test and had later failed during an actual flight test, an incident that had cost the company a smaller contract and had, in its aftermath, prompted Marcus to spend his own time, unpaid and unrequested, researching thermal cycling failure modes and precision sensors, reading manufacturer technical papers on his lunch breaks for months afterward, because he had never wanted to be caught flat-footed by a failure he could have anticipated. It was this detail, more than any single data point in Marcus's testing notes, that visibly affected the room. One of Corrigan's own senior engineers, a quiet woman named Priya Nair, who had said almost nothing throughout the meeting, spoke up at this point to confirm that she remembered the earlier incident well and that she had not been aware, until that exact moment, that a warehouse floor inspector had independently studied the failure mode in enough depth to recognize its recurrence years later, in a completely different supplier's product. Dr. Alvarez asked one final question before the meeting moved to logistics. She asked Marcus whether, knowing everything he knew now, he would make the same decision again, refusing to sign the certification even if he had known in advance that it would cost him his job. Marcus answered without hesitation. He told her that his children were watching him decide, even if they weren't in the room, and that there was no version of the answer that involved him coming home and telling them their father had signed something he didn't believe in order to keep a paycheck coming. Dr. Alvarez, according to 2 people present in the room that day, did not respond immediately, and when she did, it was only to say that she wished more of the engineers she worked with across the entire defense industry thought about their signatures the way Marcus Whitlow apparently did. Marcus had not spoken to Renee more than a handful of times in the 2 years since their divorce had finalized, conversations limited almost entirely to logistics involving Ellie and Danny's schedules. It surprised him, therefore, when she called him 3 weeks into the investigation, having heard the broad outline of what had happened from Ellie during one of the children's regular weekend visits. The conversation was brief and, by the standards of their post-divorce relationship, unusually warm. Renee told him she had always known he was the kind of person who would do something like this, and that she wanted him to know, whatever complicated feelings remained between them, that she was proud of the example he was setting for their kids. Marcus, who had spent a great deal of energy in the years since the divorce, trying not to need Renee's approval for anything, found himself surprised by how much it meant to hear her say it anyway. He told her, in that same conversation, something he had not yet said aloud to anyone else, not even to Terrence. He told her that in the 4 days between his firing and Corrigan's call asking him to come back, he had seriously considered whether he had made the right choice, whether principal was worth what it might cost Ellie and Danny if the mortgage fell behind, if the health insurance lapsed. If the entire foundation of stability he had fought so hard to build for them in the aftermath of the divorce crumbled over a $3 sensor, nobody outside a narrow slice of the defense industry would ever hear about. Renee told him that doubting himself during those 4 days did not undo the fact that he had still made the right choice anyway, and that the two things, doubt and courage, had never actually been opposites to begin with. Nearly 2 years after the investigation concluded, Marcus received an unexpected letter forwarded through Corrigan's corporate office from an Air Force major named Christopher Dang, a test pilot who had flown the targeting pod system during a later phase of evaluation flights, once the corrected sensors had been fully implemented and cleared. Major Dang had learned about the original defect and Marcus's role in flagging it through a briefing document circulated among the test squadron, and he had written, in a short, unpolished letter that Marcus keeps folded inside the same desk drawer as the decommissioned sensor, simply to say thank you. He wrote that he did not know Marcus, had never met him, and likely never would, but that he had flown high-stress evaluation maneuvers in that targeting pod system more than 40 times in the 18 months since the corrected sensors were implemented, trusting his life and the success of his mission to components he had never personally inspected and never would, and that it mattered to him more than Marcus could probably understand from the other end of a supply chain thousands of miles away, that somewhere at the beginning of that chain, someone had cared enough about getting it right to lose his job over it. Marcus read that letter at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening, Ellie doing homework across from him the same way she had the day he was fired, and he did not tell her, at first, what the letter said. He simply sat with it for a long while, the way he had learned to sit with difficult things over the years, before finally sliding it across the table and letting her read it herself. She read it twice in silence, and then looked up at her father and told him that this, more than the reinstatement, more than the new title, more than anything else that had happened over the past 2 years, was the part of the story she would remember for the rest of her life. Marcus now spends part of every new employee orientation at Corrigan Aerospace's Wichita facility telling a shortened version of this story, not as a cautionary tale about what happens to companies that ignore quality concerns, though it is certainly that, but as a plain statement of what he expects from every person who will ever hold his old job on the inspection line. He tells them that the tolerance range printed on any specification sheet is a floor, not a ceiling, and that a component technically passing spec does not relieve an inspector of the responsibility to trust their own trained judgment when something still feels wrong. He tells them that he does not expect every flag concern to be correct, that plenty of his own instincts over 11 years turned out, on closer testing, to be nothing at all, false alarms that cost the company a day or two of delayed testing and nothing more. But he tells them that the cost of a false alarm, a delayed shipment, an annoyed supervisor, a wasted afternoon of testing, will always, without exception, be smaller than the cost of a missed defect, and that anyone who tells them otherwise is asking them to gamble with something that is not theirs to gamble with. He does not tell every new hire about Ellie and Danny watching him decide whether to sign that certification, or about the 4 days he spent wondering whether he had destroyed his family's stability over a hunch. But he tells the ones who ask, the ones who linger after orientation with a question in their eyes he recognizes from his own younger self, and he tells them the truth, that doing the right thing rarely feels heroic in the moment. It mostly just feels like fear and a very small, very stubborn refusal to sign your name to something you don't believe, and a hope, not always fully earned, that the fear and the refusal will turn out, somehow, to have been worth it in the end. From Marcus Whitlow, in the end they were. It would be easy, in the retelling of this story, to paint Craig Dellamore as a simple villain, a man who chose a shipment deadline over safety without a second thought. The truth, as Marcus came to understand it during the months of investigation that followed, was more complicated, and Marcus, to his own credit, never allowed himself the comfort of the simpler version. Craig had joined Corrigan 4 years earlier from a much larger aerospace supplier, where production targets had been enforced with a rigidity that left little room for the kind of judgment calls Marcus was accustomed to making. He had been hired at Corrigan specifically to tighten the plant's production efficiency, following 2 consecutive quarters in which missed shipment deadlines had nearly cost the company its status as a preferred supplier on the defense contract altogether. Craig understood, perhaps better than almost anyone else in that boardroom, exactly how fragile Corrigan's position within the supply chain actually was, and he had spent 4 years internalizing a lesson his own leadership had repeatedly reinforced. That missed deadlines carried consequences swift and certain enough to threaten the plant's very existence, while quality concerns that fell technically within tolerance felt, in the moment, like risks that could be managed rather than emergencies. That demanded an immediate halt. This was not, the investigation ultimately concluded, an excuse. Craig's decision to override Marcus's request for extended testing was found to be a direct and proximate cause of the defect reaching the prime contractor's testing facility, and his resignation, 3 weeks after the settlement, was not entirely voluntary, arriving alongside a clear signal from Corrigan's board that his continued presence in a production leadership role was no longer tenable. But Marcus, when he spoke about Craig at all in later years, tended to speak less about blame and more about the structural pressure that had shaped Craig's decision, a pressure Marcus believed had existed at Corrigan long before Craig arrived and had simply found in him a manager willing to act on it in a moment that happened to matter more than most. It was this understanding, more than any formal recommendation from the investigation, that led Marcus, once he held real authority as Director of Quality Assurance Integrity, to push hardest not for punitive measures against individual managers, but for a structural change, an explicit board-level policy stating that no production deadline, regardless of contractual penalty, could override a documented quality hold once a qualified inspector had formally flagged a concern in the company's tracking system. It was, Marcus told the board when he proposed it, the single change that would have prevented everything that happened to him and everything that nearly happened to the pilots flying the finished product, regardless of which individual manager happened to be sitting in Craig Delamore's chair at the time. 5 years after his reinstatement, Marcus Whitlow remains Corrigan Aerospace Manufacturing's Director of Quality Assurance Integrity, a position that, under his leadership, has grown to include a small team of inspectors trained specifically in the extended thermal cycling protocols he once had to fight to have taken seriously. The company has not had a single quality-related shipment suspension in the 5 years since the policy change he championed took effect. The record Marcus is quietly, privately proud of in a way he rarely mentions aloud, preferring instead to let the number speak for itself in the quarterly reports that circulate among Corrigan's leadership. Ellie graduated high school as valedictorian and is now in her 2nd year at Kansas State University, studying mechanical engineering with a focus on materials testing, a path she has told her father, more than once, she chose in no small part because of the 11 flag sensors that changed the trajectory of their family's life when she was 13 years old. Danny, now 14, has expressed interest in following his father into quality assurance work someday, though Marcus, with characteristic dry humor, tells people he is doing everything in his power to convince his son that there are less stressful ways to make a living. Terrence Okafor and Marcus remain close friends. Their relationship deepened rather than complicated by the professional role Terrence played during the whistleblower proceedings. Terrence has since represented 2 other defense industry whistleblowers using Marcus's case as a reference point, a development neither man anticipated on the Saturday afternoon Terrence drove to that boardroom meeting on an hour's notice, prepared to make sure his friend did not walk into that room alone. Victor Kowalski retired from Corrigan 2 years ago, and, at his retirement dinner, in front of nearly the entire Wichita plant staff, he told a story he had never told publicly before about the phone call he made to Marcus on that Saturday morning and about how frightened he had been, dialing a number belonging to a man he had fired 4 days earlier, unsure whether Marcus would even answer. He told the room that Marcus had answered, had listened, had eventually agreed to come in, and had never once, in the years since, made Victor feel smaller for the mistake that had nearly cost the company everything. Marcus, sitting near the back of the room that evening, did not say much in response, only that he had learned a long time ago, first from raising 2 kids through a difficult divorce and later from a boardroom full of frightened executives, that most people are not looking for someone to make them feel small. They are looking for someone to help them find their way to doing better, and that this, more than any title or any settlement, was the work he had actually spent his career doing. The $3 sensor still sits in his desk drawer, a small, unremarkable reminder of everything that once nearly went wrong, and everything that, because one tired inspector refused to sign his name to a lie, ultimately went right. People who hear this story for the first time often fixate on the number, $3, the cost of the sensor that nearly cost a defense contractor its largest contract and very nearly cost Marcus his career before it saved it. Marcus understands the fixation. There is something almost absurd about it, the idea that a career, a family stability, and potentially the safety of a military pilot flying a targeting system 30,000 feet above the ground could all hinge on a component so small and so cheap that most people would never think twice about it. But Marcus has come, over the years, to see the $3 differently. He does not think the story is really about the sensor at all. He thinks it is about the space between what a specification sheet says and what actually happens when a piece of equipment is asked to perform under real-world stress, a space that exists in nearly every complex system built by human beings, and that can only ever be closed by someone willing to look past the paperwork and ask whether the thing in front of them actually does what it claims to do. He has said, in more than one interview conducted after the Inspector General's findings became a minor case study within defense manufacturing circles, that he does not consider himself a hero and that he actively dislikes the word when people use it to describe him. He considers himself, instead, simply an inspector who did his job on one Tuesday morning, the same way he had tried to do his job on every other morning for 11 years before it and every morning since. What changed, he says, was not him. What changed was that on that particular Tuesday, doing his job correctly happened to cost him something enormous, and he found out, in the 4 days that followed, exactly what kind of man he was going to be when the cost came due. He was, it turned out, exactly the kind of man his 11-year-old daughter already believed him to be. And in the end, for Marcus Whitlow, that turned out to matter more than the $980 million, more than the reinstatement, more than the new title on his office door. It was simply the truth about himself he had been fortunate enough to discover, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the quietest, most unglamorous way imaginable, by refusing to sign a piece of paper he did not believe.